I'm 83 years old, and a few months ago, my daughter called me and said something that many older people eventually hear. Mom, we need to talk about your living situation. The moment she said those words, I knew what was coming. At a certain age, people start talking about where you should live, whether you should move in with family, hire caregivers, or move into a facility. But after trying all of those things, I learned something most people never talk about. And today, I want to share what actually worked. After my husband Richard passed away, the house felt different in a way I cannot fully explain. We had lived there together for 46 years. Every room held a memory. The kitchen where we shared morning coffee. The living room where we watched the evening news together. Even the small creak in the hallway floorboards reminded me of the thousands of times we had walked through that house side by side. Suddenly, it was just me. At first, I told myself I was managing well. I kept the same routines. I cooked my meals, watered the plants, and paid the bills, just like always. In many ways, life looked the same from the outside. But the quiet was different. It wasn't peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes a house feel much larger than it used to be. Sometimes I would catch myself setting the table for two before realizing there was only one chair that needed to be filled now. And that was the moment I began learning what living alone truly means. The changes didn't happen all at once. In fact, that's what makes aging so difficult to notice at first. It doesn't arrive with a loud announcement. It arrives quietly, through small moments you barely pay attention to. One day I noticed that climbing the basement stairs left me a little more breathless than usual. I paused halfway up, holding the railing longer than I used to. Another day I struggled to open a jar of pickles. Richard had always been the one who handled things like that. I stood there in the kitchen, twisting the lid, laughing softly to myself. But inside, something felt different. Then there were the little memory slips. I would walk into a room and suddenly forget why I had gone there. Nothing serious, just small lapses that most people brush aside. But one morning, something happened that truly frightened me. I stepped out of the shower and my foot slipped on the tile. For a split second, I lost my balance. My hand grabbed the towel bar and I managed to catch myself before falling. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, because in that instant, a thought crossed my mind that had never been there before. What if next time I don't catch myself? That night, after the fall in the bathroom, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about that moment when I nearly slipped. My mind kept replaying the same question over and over again. What if next time I don't catch myself? Living alone had always felt like independence. But that night, it started to feel a little like risk. The next morning, I called my daughter. I tried to sound casual when I asked, as if it were just a temporary idea. Maybe I could come stay with you for a little while, I said, just until I feel steadier. She didn't hesitate for even a second. Of course, Mom, she said. You should have asked sooner. A week later, I packed a few bags and moved into her house. At first, it felt comforting. The house was full again. Voices in the kitchen, grandchildren running down the hallway, the sound of people moving around in the evenings. For the first time in months, I didn't feel so alone. Family dinners returned. We talked, laughed, shared stories, and for a little while, it almost felt like life had gone back to normal. But after a few weeks, I began to notice something else, something that slowly changed how I felt about living there. After the first few weeks, the rhythm of my daughter's house became clearer. Everyone had their own schedules. My daughter and her husband left early for work each morning. The grandchildren hurried off to school with backpacks and half-finished breakfasts, and then the house would become quiet again. Most afternoons I sat alone in the living room, just as I had done in my own house. The difference was that this wasn't my home, it was theirs. At first, I tried to stay out of the way. I washed my own dishes, folded blankets, kept the television low. I wanted to make sure I wasn't creating extra work for anyone. But little moments began to happen. "Mom, maybe don't use so much salt," my daughter would say gently while we cooked. "Mom, could you turn the TV down? The kids are studying." They weren't being unkind, not at all. They were simply living their lives. Still, something inside me started to shift. I began to feel less like a member of the household and more like a visitor who had stayed longer than expected. Then one evening, something happened that I was never meant to hear. I was walking past the hallway when I heard my daughter speaking quietly on the phone with her sister. She sounded tired. "I know it's the right thing to do," she said softly, "but honestly, it's exhausting. I can't even run to the store without worrying about Mom." She didn't mean for me to hear that, but I did. And that was the moment I realized something painful. Living with family doesn't always remove loneliness. Sometimes it simply changes the shape of it. After that night, I began thinking more seriously about finding another solution. My daughter never asked me to leave. In fact, she continued to reassure me that I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. But once you hear something like that, once you realize how much pressure someone is quietly carrying, it changes the way you see things. A few weeks later, we decided to try something different. Instead of me moving out, we hired a professional caregiver to come during the day. The idea was simple. Someone could check on me, help with meals, remind me to take my medications, and keep me company while the rest of the family was busy. At first, it sounded like the perfect solution. The woman who came was kind and professional. She helped with small things around the house and often sat with me at the kitchen table for tea. Sometimes we talked about her children. Sometimes we watched television together. But there was still something missing. Caregivers can help with tasks. They can make sure you are safe. They can cook meals and keep schedules organized. But companionship is different. You cannot schedule genuine connection by the hour. And slowly, I began to realize that even with help, something important was still missing from my life. One afternoon, while my caregiver was helping me organize a few old boxes in the garage, I came across something I hadn't seen in years. It was a photo album. The cover was worn, the pages slightly yellow with time. When I opened it, I found pictures from decades ago. Family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and small, everyday moments that once felt ordinary, but now felt incredibly precious. There was a picture of Richard and me standing in front of our first little house. We were young, smiling, full of plans we had no idea how to achieve yet. As I turned the pages, I realized something. My life hadn't been defined by the years I spent worrying about aging or the years I spent feeling lonely. It had been defined by connection, friends dropping by for coffee, neighbors helping each other with small repairs, church gatherings, community events, shared laughter around dinner tables. Somewhere along the way, many of those connections had quietly faded. Not because people stopped caring, but because life moved forward, families moved away, routines changed. That afternoon, sitting there with those old photographs spread across the table, I began to understand something important. The real problem wasn't simply aging, it was isolation. And if isolation was the real problem, then perhaps there was still a way to solve it. A few days after finding that old photo album, I began thinking about something I hadn't considered before. What if the answer wasn't living completely alone, and it also wasn't living entirely dependent on family? What if there was another way? Later that week, my daughter mentioned a small community center not far from her neighborhood. They hosted activities for older adults. Simple things like morning coffee gatherings, book clubs, walking groups, and weekly lunches. At first, I wasn't sure it was for me. The idea of walking into a room full of strangers at my age felt a little intimidating. After spending so much time in quiet spaces, I had grown used to keeping to myself. But one morning, I decided to give it a try. I remember standing outside the building for a moment before going in. I almost turned around. Then I opened the door. Inside, a group of people were sitting around a long table, laughing about something that had happened during their morning walk. One woman waved and invited me to join them. Within minutes, someone handed me a cup of coffee. And just like that, something changed. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had stepped back into life again. Over the next few weeks, that small community center slowly became part of my routine. Every Tuesday morning, a group of us would meet for coffee and conversation. On Thursdays, some of us joined a gentle walking group that circled the nearby park. The pace was slow, but that wasn't the point. The point was being together. What surprised me most was how quickly strangers began to feel familiar. There was Margaret, who was 91 and still told the funniest stories about her years as a school teacher. George, who brought homemade cookies every Friday and insisted they were good for the soul, if not for the waistline. And Helen, who had lost her husband just a year before and understood the quiet loneliness that sometimes follows you home. None of us were there because life was perfect. We were there because we had learned something important. Independence doesn't always mean doing everything alone. Sometimes real independence means building new connections, even later in life. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like I was simply waiting for the days to pass. I felt like I was living them again. If there's one thing I've learned through these years, it's this. Growing older is not the real problem. The real danger is believing that life slowly closes its doors after a certain age. For a long time, I believed that too. When my husband passed away, when the house grew quiet, when I began noticing the small changes in my body, it felt like the world was getting smaller. But life doesn't truly become smaller unless we stop reaching outward. What I discovered at 83 is something I wish someone had told me much earlier. You are never too old to rebuild connection. You are never too old to find new routines. And you are certainly never too old to feel that your life still matters. Loneliness can make the future feel empty, but a single conversation, a shared cup of coffee, a simple walk with someone who understands your story, those small moments can bring life back into the days ahead. So if you are growing older and feeling alone, please remember this. Your story is not over. Sometimes the next chapter simply begins with opening one small door you almost didn't walk through. Looking back now, I realize something that took me many years to understand. Aging is not just about the body getting older. It is about learning how to keep your life open, even when circumstances try to close it. There will be moments when the house feels too quiet, moments when you miss the people who once filled your days, moments when you wonder if the world is slowly moving on without you. But the truth is, life is still moving with you. At 83, I still wake up each morning with something to look forward to. A walk, a conversation, a laugh with someone who understands the strange and beautiful journey of growing older. And that, to me, is the real secret. Not avoiding age, but continuing to live fully, openly, and with people around you, no matter how many years have passed. Because sometimes the most meaningful chapters of life are the ones we write much later than we expected. That's when I realized something important about aging. You don't always have to choose between complete independence and complete dependence. There is a space in between, a space called community, where people help each other, not because they're paid, but because they care. Today I'm still living in my home. I still have challenges, but I'm not lonely anymore, because I still have something to give. And that is something many older people forget. Growing older doesn't mean becoming useless. It simply means discovering new ways to matter. And at 83, I'm still learning how to do that.